Welcome, everybody. My name is Bob Truby, and I am the director of the Emerging Scholars Network. And we are happy to have you with us on this call today. I think for many of us, we were deeply, deeply disturbed by the events of January 6th. I think for many of us, we had a sense until then that it can't happen here. That it can't happen at the heart of our democratic institutions. Our conversation partner today has written a book that argues that our assumptions as a people about human nature and how those assumptions play out in our democratic system may well play an important role in our democracy's future. And so I'm very glad today to be able to have a conversation with Tracy McKenzie. Before we do, I'd like to just touch on a couple of housekeeping details. First of all, I want to let you know that we will be recording the conversation today. And if you prefer not to be recorded or photographed, you may wish to keep your mic muted and disable your video. By continuing to participate in the ESN conversation with your video and or audio enabled, after our recording begins, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes, including posting a video recording online for asynchronous viewing. I'll stop the recording now to allow you to disable your video if you prefer not to be recorded. My guest today is Robert Tracy McKenzie, and he goes by Tracy most of the time. And he is the Arthur F. Holmes Chair of Faith and Learning and a professor of history at Wheaton College. His books include Lincolnites and Rebels, A Little Book for New Historians, and The First Thanksgiving, What the Real Story Tells Us About Loving God and Learning from History, which is a great book, by the way, that I read several years ago, and it might be fun to read prior to Thanksgiving. He's an Atlanta Braves fan, and he's a Boggle addict. I also learned that he blogs on Christian faith and American history, and you can follow his reflections at the link that's on our screen, faithandamericanhistory.wordpress.com. So with that, we're going to exit the screen here, and Tracy and I will be in conversation together. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're really happy to have you with us in this conversation. Your book actually just launched this week, so this is a big week for you, and so we appreciate you taking time out of what could be a very full week to join us. You know, in our time before the conversation began, you talked about the Christian vocation and how some of that has been changing, how some of your understanding has been changing as you've gone on in your academic career. And I thought you might just talk a little bit about your own sense of calling as a Christian professor in history and how that's developed in the course of your career.
Well, first of all, Bob, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I'm grateful, looking forward to it a lot. I actually am halfway through my 34th year as a college or university professor, which is hard for me to believe. But one thing I can attest to is my understanding of my calling, what it means to be a scholar who is also a Christ follower, has really evolved a lot over time. And when I share it, I never share it to suggest that my way is meant to be sort of exemplary or that I'm challenging others to follow my example, but it's the path that God has taken me on. When I came out of graduate school, I felt called to be a Christian professor on a secular campus, and primarily for the purposes of evangelism. I really thought that I would primarily be distinctively Christian by the Bible studies that I led in the evening hours and the conversations that I had informally with students and colleagues outside of class. But I really wasn't thinking, honestly, about my scholarship being distinctively Christian at all. And it was years into my career before that began to change. If I were to share my own sense of calling, though, right now, it is very significantly, very explicitly to me, a desire to be in conversation with other Christians, and primarily other Christians outside of the academy. Some Christian historians do write explicitly as believers, but they tend to write almost always for academic readers. And I'm doing my best, whether I've succeeded or not, I'm not sure, but I'm doing my best to try to reach the sorts of people that I would meet sitting beside me on a pew on a Sunday morning worship service. And so that is my particular sense of calling, to be in conversation with other Christians at the intersection of the life of the mind and the love of God and the engagement with the past.
Well, I think that gives us a wonderful model of moving, of this development from contributing significantly to your field and so forth to moving into a role of public scholarship. And certainly that's something of what this book seems to represent, is public work in the university. Well, let's talk about the book. You begin your book with a quote that's most often attributed to Alexis de Tocqueville, that he never wrote or said. And I wonder if you tell us about that and how the use of this quote is actually important to your book's thesis.
Sure. So the quote itself, as you alluded to, Bob, is attributed to Alexis de Tocqueville, this visitor to the United States in 1831. And Tocqueville is supposed to have reported when he returned to France that he had searched for the cause of America's greatness, and he had searched high and low. He had searched in our fertile fields, in our humming factories, in our houses of government and so forth. And he had never found the cause for American greatness until he entered America's churches. And he heard the gospel sort of flaming forth from pulpits across the country, and he knew now why America was great. And the answer is America's great because America's good. And if you know the rest of it, he goes on to say, if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. I use that in part because I was wanting to connect with the present, to believe it or not. And when I began to write the book, which was actually in the spring of 2017, the 2016 presidential race was fresh in my mind, and in particular, an episode in which Hillary Clinton, before the Democratic National Convention, had said something right along these lines: America is great because America is good. And the Twitter sphere sort of lit up with all sorts of allegations of plagiarism, and lots of authorities saying, doesn't she realize that we know that this is from Alexis de Tocqueville? And of course it wasn't. And so that became a kind of springboard for thinking about how we as Americans describe ourselves to one another, or at least in political contexts. So I like to use that idea, America is good, is great because America is good, as a kind of springboard for thinking about that historically. And so we move directly from there to the late 18th century and ask ourselves, who among America's founders would have argued that? And it turns out to be, it's very difficult to find that any of them would have argued that. So understanding how it came to be that such a specious quote could be received as deep wisdom is really one of the things that the book is trying to do.
Well, that's great. You make the contention that the founders who wrote the Constitution didn't share that optimistic assessment about human nature. Why didn't they? And how are their different assumptions reflected in the Constitution?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll just say by way of preface, one of the things I don't try to do in the book is to get into the debate that has so often sucked all the air out of academic conversations, and that is whether we should think of the leading founders as, in some sense, orthodox in their religious beliefs or not. Were they trying to create a Christian nation or not? I just want to focus on what they said explicitly in terms of how they understood human nature. Their views were complicated, and when I share them with students, there's always a temptation, I think, for them to conclude that I'm saying that the founders' views were more unidimensional than they were. They were actually complex in that they believed that there was great potential in human nature. They would have argued that it is really sort of illogical to consider self-government unless you believe that there's some dimension of potential for virtue among human beings. But they paired that with a really healthy sort of appreciation of human selfishness. For some, that would have been a view that I think was a direct result of Orthodox Christian belief. For others, it was gained from the study of history. For others, it was something that they believed that the best political philosophy of the Enlightenment sort of pointed to. And for a lot of the key founders, it was some combination of all these things. And I don't really try to pin down the exact origins of these views as much as to call attention to how universal they were. John Jay, who was would become the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. He sort of summed it up. He said the mass of people are neither wise nor good. And that would have been almost considered a truism at the time. It's very difficult to find a dissenting voice from that among the individuals who were prominent leaders of the revolutionary generation. So the question that I ask as an author, as a Christian author, is simply, how might we think of this view in the light of Christian scripture? And of course, this is something even that Christians can disagree upon, but I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that in the context of Protestant orthodoxy as it was understood in the 18th century, this view resonated, harmonized pretty well with the predominant Christian understanding of human nature. And so that view that we are basically self-interested, that we are so self-interested that we're willing to run over the rights of others if it serves our purposes, it does inform the Constitution. And I think it does so pervasively. I actually argue that there's hardly a line in the Constitution that in some sense is not influenced by this view, but it's not explicit. That is to say, there's no preamble that is going to say, because we believe that individuals are selfish by nature, we're doing these things. And so we have to know that underlying context. But for example, just the kinds of checks and balances that we all talk about in middle school, I guess, when we study civics, we learn to parrot that there are checks and balances in the US Constitution, but those all grow out of an assumption that power always seeks to aggrandize, to enlarge itself, and that is an expression of human nature. So the founders are saying over and over again, the lust for power, the inordinate love of recognition, ambition, which they use never as a compliment, it's actually a vice. These things drive individuals given power to pursue more power, to seek more power. And so that's just one example of how the Constitution embodies that view. All the limitations on popular influence over the founders, over the government, are also expressions of that. Sort of boil it all down, there is the idea that because we are all self-interested, whoever wields power, whether that is a majority, whether that is an aristocracy, whether that is a tiny group of elite leaders, wherever power resides, their power will be a threat to the well-being of the society.
In your account, you consider the candidacy and president of Andrew Jackson to be a key turning point in the shared assumptions around human nature. You call it the Great Reversal, and you focus a good part of your book on Jackson. Why do you think Jackson in this period is so important to the history of our democracy?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. You could write a book on that, right? I'll say a couple of things. I don't know that this great reversal happens all at once. I don't attribute it just to Andrew Jackson alone. I don't say that it happens only in a very short span of time. What is absolutely clear, however, is that circumstances of the mid-1820s, both the election that Andrew Jackson loses in 1824 and the election when he is sent to the presidency for the first time in 1828, they lay bare the fact that I think a large majority of the American people have come now to think about human nature and to think about the moral authority of majorities in ways that the framers of the Constitution would have found utterly alien. So without going into all the details of that election, maybe some of our listeners are familiar with that, but in 1824, Andrew Jackson wins both the popular vote and the Electoral College vote by a plurality, but not a majority. And in the runoff that goes to the House of Representatives in early 1825, the second place minister, John Quincy Adams, is elected president over Jackson. And the response to that is significant. The response all across Jackson's followers that this is fundamentally illegitimate. It's fundamentally illegitimate because any decision that contradicts the wishes of the majority is fundamentally illegitimate. They'll go farther than that. They'll say it's fundamentally unconstitutional. And that's one of the things I enjoyed the most, which is just this sort of blind assumption that the Constitution surely says whatever we think it needs to say in the moment. And so arguments over and over and over again that those congressmen that decided to cast their vote for John Quincy Adams had violated the Constitution, and more significantly maybe, violated a deep moral obligation to implement the wishes of the majority. The final thing that strikes me about all that is that Jackson hadn't won a majority ever. He won about 40% of the vote. But by claiming that he has a majority, they're sort of building on this argument now that the majority has a kind of unassailable moral authority. And so I think there's a sense in which the underlying values that had been evolving probably over the course of a couple of generations are suddenly laid bare. And I would really argue that by the middle of the 1820s, in some senses, the United States had entered the modern political era that we know today. For all the differences that separate us from the 1820s, almost 2 centuries ago now, for all the differences, I think our understandings of human nature and how that informs the political process were beginning to look very much like our own today.
The other figure you give it significant attention to here is Alexis de Tocqueville. And you suggest that often he is either not read or misunderstood if he is. What do you believe is important that we grasp from his writings? And
well, gosh,
yeah.
Sorry, excuse me.
Go ahead.
I interrupted you. I'm sorry. I was suggesting again just how difficult, how good but challenging the question is, because Tocqueville touches on everything. The Democracy in America, the work that he writes that focuses primarily on the United States, is so far-reaching in its scope. Almost no intellectual questions seem to escape his interest or his curiosity, and so it becomes difficult. One of the things I would say about Tocqueville, and I'm hardly the first person to say it, is that Americans have been far more fond of quoting him than reading. One columnist calls it maybe the greatest of the great unread books. And so we like to think that Tocqueville is on our side, but we rarely read him. To bring it back to the specious quote with which I begin the book, there are writers today, very popular writers, who would say, well, even if Tocqueville didn't say that America is great because she's good, he believed it. And the thrust of his argument is exactly that. But that's not true. In fact, it's hard to more badly misrepresent what Tocqueville is saying. Tocqueville had an approach to democracy which is very important for us to wrestle with. We don't have to accept it, but I think it challenges us deeply and probably promotes, I think, more Christian reflection than would be otherwise the case. Tocqueville starts with the idea that democracy is morally indeterminate, that it does not necessarily lead to morally justifiable outcomes. It may, but it does not have to. There's nothing intrinsic in democracy that guarantees that. So he starts there. Then he looks at the United States and he actually says, but you know what, all things considered, the outcomes in the United States seem to be more often than not morally acceptable. And in particular, he believes that there's all kinds of potential for authoritarian abuses, what he called the tyranny of the majority. He doesn't see a lot of evidence of that. Now, one of the things you have to understand with Tocqueville is that he's really focusing on the white population. He is scathing in his condemnation of slavery. He's scathing in his condemnation of the removal of Native Americans. but he looks at the way the white majority treats one another, and he says, well, there's really less abuses of individual rights than I would have expected. So why is that? And the answer that he comes at, which is the one that we as Christians often really want to latch on to, is that it surely has something to do with the religiosity of the American people. And so there's something about the impact of religion on American cultural values that is having a kind of moderating effect, an inhibiting effect that prevents or discourages the majority from abusing the minority. And that is absolutely true. I mentioned in the book that there's the Tocqueville that we really want to hear, want to believe, and there's the Tocqueville that we need to hear, need to believe. We like to hear that important contribution of religious faith to flourishing democracy, and that is absolutely something that Tocqueville argues. But he also argues that American Christianity, as he observes it, is still fairly worldly. In fact, he describes American society, Americans, as the greediest people on the face of the earth. And when he looks at American Christianity, he sees something that today we would sort of call the health and wealth or prosperity gospel is fairly common. The other thing that he says about American Christianity, he says if there's a secret to its flourishing in the United States, it's because there has been such an assiduous effort on the part of religious leaders to avoid any close connection with any political movement, any political party, or any political individual. That's not how I would characterize American life today. So office to say, Tocqueville says some things that absolutely speak to the indispensable contribution of religion to a flourishing democracy. And he shares a lot of things that disturb him and should disturb us if they are true characterizations of the religion that he observed. Tocqueville talks in terms of his hopes and his fears for the future of democracy. And I think that's the only way to read Tocqueville. If you come away only encouraged, you haven't read him deeply enough. You shouldn't be only cynical or discouraged. He wants us to wrestle with both some very positive possibilities and some very troubling eventualities that could occur.
Well, your book elaborates some of the tensions in our understanding of democracy. For example, this tension between majority rule and justice, or the tension between liberty and safety, which is one that we are in the middle of.
Yep.
How may our assumptions about human nature help us as we navigate through those tensions?
Yeah, that's good. So if I could start again with the founders, which is sort of the way the whole book is structured. The founders really held two ideas always, it seems to me, in tension with one another, and to recapture their thinking, we must do the same. One is that they believe the majority absolutely must rule. They weren't opposed to majority rule. They really believed that a society where the majority didn't generally prevail was not a free society. But at the same time, on the other hand, they said, but the majority is not inescapably just. And they did not have a solution for ensuring that. There was no way to protect against the possibility of majority injustice. So a lot of the way that they approached the question of majority was always keeping in mind the idea of human fallenness, although they often didn't use that language, but the idea of human selfishness as a means of being cautious about the use of majority power, about a reason for being reserved about one's own views as potentially flawed, potentially distorted by self-interest. So it led to what Tocqueville would have identified as a kind of habit of restraint. One of the things that I think is lost is that idea of a kind of habit of restraint that says that power, whoever wields it, for whatever purpose it is wielded, carries always the potential of abuse and injustice. When I look at our political dialogues today, and of course others I'm sure see this very differently, but I see a political dialogue that almost always externalizes evil and assumes that a great part of the solution for solving whatever ills concern us in our society is to making sure that the right people have the right power. And to me, that is a view that does not take seriously original sin, that doesn't understand that anyone that is wielding that power will still have the effects of the fall on their own hearts and character. And so I think beginning with an appreciation of that fallen nature, taken seriously, begins to bear fruit in a couple of ways. One, a certain sense of humility about one's own views, and then ideally, a predisposition to exercise charity toward the views of others. I'm not the first one to argue at all that when we begin to combine power with an absolute confidence in one's righteousness, we've created an explosive and very dangerous kind of condemnation. One of the things that I use sort of to frame the book occasionally is an observation that C.S. Lewis made in one of his lesser known essays, which I'll just paraphrase here. And his observation is there's really only two reasons that you would ever really believe in majority rule. One is because you have great confidence in human nature, and the other is because you don't have any confidence at all in human nature. And so I actually think we can promote democracy without having to deny the implications of original sin. And what that looks like, by the way, I've never found a better example of this in any of my reading than in a really little known scenario that happens during the ratification of the Constitution. There is a debate taking place in the Massachusetts State Ratification Convention. And this man rises, his name is Samuel Thompson. I know nothing about him. He was not a significant player, but he must have been important enough to be a delegate to the state convention. He is identified as a tavern keeper. And he rises to object to some particular provision when an individual say, but wait a minute, you're being too negative in your understanding of the government. He says, I suspect my heart and I will suspect my rulers. In other words, he is criticizing the power that might be accorded to the federal government because he knows his own heart. And I don't think that's a position that we see in any of our debates today. At least I don't know the last time I heard a politician say, I object to this proposal from the other party, primarily because I know myself so well. And I fear giving power that I would abuse to someone else.
Well, hey, that's a good place for us to stop. We're going to take a break and talk about how people can get your book. And while we're doing that, I would encourage you to feel free to put some questions in the chat. We'd love to have some queued up as we get started in our next section of things. So the book we're talking about today is We the Fallen People, and it may be ordered at a 40% discount for people on this call through InterVarsity Press. Going to the web link for that, which is ivpress.com, We the Fallen People. And at checkout, you'll want to use the discount code GFMWEB, GFMWeb21. And you can order that at a 40% discount. I thought it was a great read. Part of it is I'm a history buff, but it was an excellent study, I thought, of kind of American history through the lens of our assumptions about human nature. So I'd invite you to pick up a copy. Excuse me. Okay, well, we're going to go on. I don't see any questions in the chat yet. So if there are some things that you've been wanting to ask Tracy, I'd love for you to get those into the chat. While we do it, one of the things, at the conclusion of your book, you talked some about some of the specifics of implications for us about if we have an understanding of human fallenness, how we think about democracy, and how we behave as citizens. Maybe you might say a few words about that as we get a few things into the chat.
Sure. So, I try to conclude the book by talking a little bit about application, which is something that, as scholars, we don't always think is appropriate. It depends upon the nature of the work, but I very much wanted to speak to that. My wife once said that in terms of spiritual gifts, my spiritual gift is the gift of discouragement. I'm good at sort of making people discouraged, but not giving hope. So I wanted to talk about some practical ways that we might respond. And I just mentioned a few. One is to regain our sense of the importance of rhetoric, of political rhetoric. I argue that the way that we frame political arguments are always making, among other things, all kinds of ideological claims that go beyond any kind of policy that's being promoted. And in particular, I think a lot of the way that we frame political issues has some sort of bearing on what we're claiming to believe about human nature. So taking political rhetoric seriously, thinking about power seriously. I suspect when we look at the way that Americans break down on issues, it's almost always, I think, the case that we only fear power when the other side wields it. And so there will be all sorts of debates, for example, about presidential executive orders and how awful they are until our guys in the White House, then we decide, well, that's probably okay. So that would be another example. I think Tocqueville's advice about distancing ourselves from political parties is good. Remember, Tocqueville is writing from a French perspective. He believes that the close association of the monarchy with the Catholic Church that had historically evolved there was one of the main reasons that he believed that Catholicism was in shambles in France. And so he said what had happened, he feared, was that the church had sort of lashed itself to a cadaver, that's his wording, and that when the monarchy toppled, it brought the church down with it. And his book is, across the centuries, it's a heartfelt plea that we don't do that we don't repeat that kind of mistake.
We have a question from David. You talk about the majority, but it doesn't seem in the maybe in the popular, in the sense that we often use of a popular majority.
So I'm using the term majority in a certain sense. If we're thinking of American society, either at the time of the framers or even in the 1820s and 1830s, as a society where the majority of the population has an active voice in electing representatives and so forth, well, of course, that's not true. So this is a time when, for the most part, by the 1830s, you do have universal white male suffrage, not entirely, but close. But of course, disfranchisement of women, disfranchisement of African Americans, most immigrants, at least for a period of time. Their philosophy, though, in thinking about majoritarianism, I think is absolutely transferable to other contexts. Their argument philosophically is that the majority can abuse the minority just as well as any minority might tyrannize the majority. And what they're not willing to do, in other words, is to attribute implicit virtue to any element of the population. And so his point is actually well taken. And I actually get into that in the book just a little bit to remind us of the various limitations on the franchise and how those were understood and justified at the time. But I think their philosophical arguments are very transferable.
Okay, going on. Gary says, historian John Fee has written about fear as a dominant factor in how many American Christians have voted. This is especially true in recent history, but seems to me it has been a factor for a very long time. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And fear is an important factor, even in the period that I'm looking at primarily. So I talk about the 1820s and 1830s, as Bob has noted, in addition to the period of the founding, in part Well, for a lot of reasons. One, I think it's the moment really when a lot of modern understandings of majority rule are beginning to coalesce, but also because I think it's the first manifestation of what we would recognize today as a populist movement. I would argue that Andrew Jackson is the nation's first populist president. Now, that wasn't a term that was used at the time, but if we understand populism as a kind of narrative that we formulate to explain our world, to explain our political ambitions, and to explain or to justify political policies when in power, there's absolutely a populist movement going on in the 1820s and 1830s. And the reason I bring that up is because I would link it entirely to fear. In a democratic culture, democratic political culture, it's very common, certainly in the United States, to divide issues into dichotomies. We think in terms of two parties, two sides to most views. And of course, any politician is going to say, you'll be better off if my side wins, if I am successful, you'll be worse off if the other side wins. That's not new. In fact, it's almost difficult for us to imagine it being any other way. What populism brings that normal democratic rhetoric lacks is the element of fear. It's the idea that not only will I be worse off if I lose this election, but my very existence in some sense is severely threatened. There's a kind of existential threat that's often part of populist rhetoric. And so fear is enormous. And fear begins to justify all kinds of compromises that in other times we might think would be unacceptable. So there's a Latin proverb, which I'm not going to be able to quote right now, but the English translation is necessity knows no law. And so the moment that you really convince yourself that you're facing an existential crisis, that your way of life as you know it cannot survive defeat in this election, it's amazing how quickly we'll decide that compromises with constitutional norms and with the rule of law are justifiable. And so I think that's something we absolutely need to keep an awareness on. There are surveys that have been done in the last 20 years periodically by an undertaking called the World Social Survey that asked questions to more than 100 countries, asked them about different forms of government. And one of the questions they asked them is to give their opinion on a form of government that is characterized by a strong leader who does not have to worry about regular elections or accountability to a legislature. In the last 3 rounds of that survey in the United States, between a fourth and a third of American respondents have said they look favorably on such a form of government. And I cannot believe that that would be remotely possible outside of a context in which we're bombarded constantly with the message that defeat at the polls brings consequences that are just not acceptable.
John says, I noticed you refer to democracy a number of times with reference to our government. I'm concerned that many don't or can't differentiate between a republic and a democracy. Please elaborate.
Great question, and a difficult one, I will say, because these terms are slippery, and even among, say, the founding generation, they're not always used consistently. A republic, in the minds of someone like Alexander Hamilton, is anything that's not a monarchy. So, for example, if you elect senators for life, as Hamilton actually proposed at the Philadelphia Convention, that's Republican, that's a republic. Even though there's not going to be regular elections, they couldn't get office apart from an election, so that's a republic. So on the one hand, a republic is anything that's not a monarchy, but that's not a real helpful definition. Well, the founders would have said there's really not truly a democratic alternative, because a democracy meant to them one thing. A democracy, as Madison puts it in Federalist 10, is a system where every eligible citizen participates in every political decision. That was what he called a pure democracy. And of course, that was not possible, not remotely possible, over any civil community of any geographical expanse. It might be conceivable for, say, a New England town meeting, but it's not going to be a model that any state, much less the United States, could follow. So the founders would have said, by necessity, we are a republic, which they defined as simply a system where the legitimacy of the government is grounded in consent of the governed, and that the consent is then manifested through representatives, not directly. So over time, this idea of a republic begins to be sort of more complicated by asking the question, okay, how democratic should the republic be? Because republic is such a broad concept. And the question basically boiled down to how responsive to the popular will should elected representatives be from moment to moment. Everyone agrees, as Madison puts it in Federalist 10, that in the long run, the deliberate sense of the majority must ultimately prevail. But does that mean that on every issue that the majority has to be followed? Well, I would argue that over time, the predominant view came to answer that question, yes. And so the degree to which a society says that the will of the majority must perpetually, regularly be embodied in policy, that society is democratic. To the degree that it leaves a place for elected representatives actually not to abide by the wishes of the majority, to determine for whatever reason that the general welfare is promoted actually by countering popular majorities, it is not democratic. The framers of the Constitution, the founding generation's leaders generally would have said that although the majority must ultimately prevail, there are times when it is a mark of the courage and the virtue and the patriotism of elected officials to curb popular wishes. And that is a view that the authors of the Federalist Papers make explicit. It's a view that's very difficult ever to articulate today without committing political suicide. So that's a very long answer to a question that seems simple, but the truth is it's not simple. Because in a republic, the majority decides ultimately. In a democracy, the majority decides ultimately. The question is, what about in the meantime? What about from day to day? Do we assume that the only legitimate outcome is one that mirrors the wishes of the majority? And that would be, in my mind, how you distinguish between the two.
Great. Good discussion. You know, I feel like I'm back in my middle school civics course in some ways, but that really helps actually. During the course of your research, have you also delved into the Liberty Festivals and socio-political discourse in America during the French Revolution? Do you see any developments of unrighteous political ethics emerged during that time? And you might give us a little bit of an explanation of those.
So I'm going to have to do something that is hard for any professor ever do, which is to say, I don't think I have a lot to add to that. It's a good question, but the book is a kind of set of post holes, if you want to think of it that way. And so or another analogy is lowering a bucket at one point into the pool deeply. And so I dig deeply in the 1780s, I leapfrog to the 1820s, and then I bring to the present, and actually don't spend much time on the 1790s. I certainly can say that the influence of the French Revolution becomes hugely controversial in the 1790s. The Federalist Party of George Washington is quite suspicious of the way that is influencing American politics. Thomas Jefferson is much more sympathetic. But one of the things that Washington does in his farewell address in 1796 is to really call attention to what at the time were known as Jacobin clubs, at least by critics, that feared that some of the influences of the French Revolution were shaping American political values. But I've told you everything I can say about the matter right there. And I'm sorry, I can't go further.
Fair enough. Ben asks, in a fallen world, are not the events of January 6th somewhat expected, especially after several months of sometimes deadly and often destructive protests from what would be perceived as, quote unquote, the other side?
Mm-hmm. Are the events of January 6th expected in a fallen world? That's a great theological question. I think we certainly expect to see fallenness always manifests itself in some way, and I think you might answer the question, yeah, that's what we're seeing. The thing that I guess I more wanted to hammer home is that for many generations, I think Americans have felt that whatever it might occur in a fallen world, it wouldn't occur in the United States. That is to say, I think there has been a kind of unthinking assumption that there's no going back from America's commitment to a kind of liberal democratic experiment. And I just don't think that's a position that we want to rest comfortably with. G.K. Chesterton wrote after he visited the United States about American democracy, about democracy generally. He says there's the case that democracy is never in greater danger. It's never less safe than when we're convinced that democracy is safe. And I think, to me, we just are reminded that that democracy is never safe. How's that? That's the first thing that I think is imprinted on my mind as I think about that.
This is a big question here. What role, John asks, what role have major political and social failures had on the current American situation? And he cites the removal of Native Americans, African American slavery, disenfranchisement of women, the brief success and then utter failure of prohibition.
Whoa, that is a big question. Well, I mean, if you think for example, I don't know, it depends on if you want to think short term or long term. When we think, okay, so this is not what the book is about, so I'll just share really quickly. Certainly those kinds of things, like the way that Americans have rethought about the place of African Americans in American life, the way that they've thought about indigenous peoples, those have changed dramatically over time. And I would say that they have had the effect of causing us often to believe that there have been mistakes in the past. What I think that often does not translate into is the belief that whatever it was about human nature that led those people at that time to engage in actions that we find unconscionable is part of human nature now. In other words, I think more often than not, we talk about these things in ways that safely externalize them from deep scrutiny of our own hearts. And so one of the things that I wanted to say in the concluding part of the book is that there is no episode in the American past that we would lament today that we are not entirely capable of imitating in some way, not exactly in the details, but in its essence today. And that was an argument that I wanted individuals of every political persuasion, every political party, every political philosophy to hear and be open to take to heart.
It's a good word. We're kind of coming to the end of our time, and I just wanted to ask if there are any final things you want to say about, about your own work on the book, or conclusions from the book that you think would be helpful for us.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that opportunity. I guess the main thing that I would just try to reiterate is I certainly did not write the book to make a kind of partisan statement. That was never my intention at all. I did write, though, out of a deep sense of burden for the church. I would like to think of myself as someone who loves his country, and I have 3 generations of family members who served in the armed forces. But my deepest burden is not for the future of American democracy, although I'm concerned for it. It's for the testimony of the church. And one of the things that I would say as a broad generalization, it's not fair for everyone, is that American Christians are not known for their deep understanding of history. And I actually believe that something like what I undertook here, which was to help us think historically about the political assumptions we take for granted, is really essential. So I actually would make the argument that faithful Christian discipleship requires that we remember faithfully. So I don't think there is ever an excuse for historical ignorance. The danger, on the other hand, is that Christians have too often gone to the past simply for evidence to reinforce whatever they already have committed themselves to, and miss out on what might be there for us. So all of which is said, I just want to end by sharing my deep burden for the church and my hope, my desire, my prayer that something in this book would be of benefit to those who are wanting to be faithful in their public testimony before the Lord.
Amen. Amen. I think that's a good place, I think, for us to end on. It is, I think you challenge us in so many ways as Christians to be thoughtful about how we engage and to connect our theology with how we think about our public engagement in the world. So thank you so much for helping us get to know the book. In a moment here, I'm going to put that back on the screen here. Just going to put something in the chat here for everyone. Again, we want to mention that the book is We the Fallen People. Go back to the book slide. And we do have it available at a 40% discount through InterVarsity Press at www.intervarsityivpress.com. We the Fallen People. And at the checkout code, use the discount code GFMWeb21. And the book came out this week, so it is available for purchase. Our next conversation is going to be on October 27th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're actually doing this in collaboration with our Women in the Academy and Professions movement within our grad and faculty ministries. And it'll be a conversation with several of the contributors to a book called Power Women. And it's addressing particularly the dominant narrative we hear as professors that motherhood and academia are incompatible. And the women who've contributed to this really address how, as Christians, they bring those aspects of their life together. And we would invite you to join us for that conversation. It will be at, you can register now at tinyurl.com, ESN Power Women. Lastly, we want to say thank you for joining us today. I'd like to thank Tracy for being a part of this discussion and sharing his time and his work on this book with us. I want to thank InterVarsity Press, who collaborates with us on these conversations, and we are very grateful for their help. And we want to thank you for joining us today, for taking the time out of your schedule to be a part of the conversation. We hope you'll consider following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ESN IVCF. You might also consider visiting and subscribing to our ESN channel on YouTube via the tinyurl.com/ESN YouTube. And this conversation will be on that channel. So please direct your friends there as well. And we hope you'll check out some of the other conversations that we've had previously. With that, we're going to